So it's a great pleasure and a privilege to be invited to speak to you about open access and open data and the link between them. The title which I was given, I'll say a couple of things before I begin. One is that I come from Scotland. Scotland is the place in the north of Great Britain, and we speak very, very quickly. We also have accents which you might not be very familiar with. So I need somebody at the back to, if I'm speaking too quickly or you can't understand what I'm saying, do something. Wave your hands or do something, because I can slow down. But I get very excited. So please let me know if I'm difficult to understand, because I understand why and I won't take any offense whatsoever. So I was asked to speak about linking open access research publications with open research data. That's actually quite a simple and straightforward thing to do. I could cover that in a couple of slides, and in fact I do cover that in a couple of slides. So I started to think about putting it in a context, a wider context. So I'm going to talk about a few things. I'll talk about the Digital Curation Centre, which is the organisation that I belong to in the UK. I'll talk about the relationship between open access to publications and open data. And I'll cover a timeline which will cover some of the elements which Birgitta covered in the earlier presentation. I didn't understand a great deal of the earlier presentation, but I understand Budapest when I hear it. So I think I know what that bit was about. I'll then talk about why it's necessary or beneficial, why it's a good thing to link publications to data, and then I'll talk about how it's actually done, and that's the core of the presentation, but also probably the shortest part of the presentation because it's quite straightforward. And then I'll conclude with some information about the Foster project, who are sponsoring this event and who I also work for. And I'll give links to some useful resources and further reading. The slides will be made available, so don't feel that you have to take big notes, or occasionally you see people with phones and iPads taking photos of the screen. Don't feel that you need to do that, because the slides will be made available very quickly after the event. So I begin with an introduction to the Digital Curation Centre, which I expect will be not familiar to many of you. We have been in existence for just over 10 years now, and what we are is a distributed organisation. We're a consortium of 3 British universities, the University of Glasgow, where I used to work, the University of Edinburgh, where I currently work, and the University of Bath, where I've never worked. And what we are is we are a UK national centre of expertise in digital preservation, and we have a particular focus now on data management. We emerged from the library and bibliographic community, although my own background is actually in IT, I'm not a librarian. And as data management became more of a hot topic in higher education, we were well placed to develop our provision to support that. So what we do, we don't actually manage data ourselves. We act as an infrastructure capability raising body, and we work with UK universities, we work with UK funders, with research libraries, with government departments, in order to identify gaps in research data management provision across the entire UK higher education sector, which is about 160 universities. And our job is to act as advocates, so we go out and say why data management and digital preservation are good and important things, and we act to raise capabilities to say what you're doing here, or to, usually people come to us and say, we have a problem, we know we need to do this because the funder mandates us to carry out digital preservation to a certain level and we don't have the skills. So we go in and we do training and advocacy, awareness raising, all that kind of thing. We also produce resources, we produce tools and publications to help people to raise their data management and digital preservation capacities. And all of the materials that we produce are available under Creative Commons licenses, so they can be built on and modified by anyone who wants to. We're involved in lots of international and European projects, that this is some of the work that the DCC takes part in, and we have counterpart organisations in Australia, the Australian National Data Service, in the Netherlands with DANS, in Finland with CSC. We're a member of the Alliance for Permanent Access, which is a big European, Australian and North American combined effort to manage research data and to increase and share resources so that we can actually move quicker and go further than each of these areas would be able to do individually. And there's a couple of things which I forgot to put on the original slide, but which I'm actually closely involved in, which is DataBib, which is a bibliography of data repositories, places where you can deposit data after a research project is completed, and DMP Tool, which is a data management planning tool developed in the US and based on or modelled after the process that we followed in the UK. So I'll give a much shorter timeline for open access and open data, and as I mentioned before, this will involve some of the same events which were mentioned in the previous talk. So open access, although it wasn't known as open access at the time, was really born in the 1980s as the internet came to be, but not before it was popularized and in every university and indeed now in every home and in every pocket with our smartphones. So it really took off as the internet became popularized and normalized in the 1990s, and online journals, that is journals which never exist in an analog format, only exist in an online form, began to become common and then increasingly to become normal. It's now not normal for journals to be printed. The internet lowered the physical barriers to accessing knowledge, which I think everyone agrees is a good thing. Brigitte gave the example of Louis Pasteur saying that science knows no boundaries and knowledge knows no country, etc. And that's all very good. Everyone kind of agrees with that until you ask them to share their own stuff. And then they say, oh, actually, there are some boundaries here and I have problems with it. So part of the work that we do is to overcome those kinds of objection. So there was an issue, again, which Brigitte mentioned in her slides, which was that as the barriers to accessing information became lower, physical barriers, as in you didn't have to go to a library to access something, you could do it on the internet, the financial barrier was actually rising, and it was rising much quicker than inflation, which led to a cost crisis in academic and research libraries. So open access to publications has become now normal. It's not ubiquitous. There are still commercial publishers who obviously resist this because it cuts into their opportunities to make profit. The scholarly community, and indeed broader than the scholarly community, the government community and science ministers and the G8, etc., have turned their attentions to the data, which acts as the evidence to research publications. It underpins their findings. And we're now in a position where research data is considered to be a first-class output of research in its own right. It's not just something which is kind of forgotten about after the publication is released and preserved. So it's up there with the same kind of value. So the development of the open access and the research data management agendas are closely linked. This is a timeline which I pulled together, derived from Peter Suber's 2009 timeline, but augmented by myself. So a very early online peer-reviewed journal would be the New Horizons in Adult Education, which emerged in 1987. 4 years after that, the Bromley Principles regarding full and open access to global change data were released. It's no coincidence that the first mention on this timeline is to do with climate change data, because one of the benefits of taking an active approach to research data management and to being open with research data is it increases the speed at which research can take place. And obviously climate change is something which we don't have a great deal of time to deal with. So that was the kind of use case for research data management which was most high priority. It was exceptionally pressing that we did not introduce unnecessary barriers to the data in order that scientists from all over the world could work together to try and deal with the issue of climate change. So the first use of the term open access was coined at a conference in Budapest in Hungary in 2001, and then subsequently it was at the end of 2001, so it was written up in papers in 2002. In 2004, the OECD issued their Declaration on Access to Research Data from Public Funding, again saying that data that is publicly funded essentially is something which belongs to the public, and they should be able to access it and do what they want with it with as few barriers as possible. In 2006, the European Research Council adopted their open access mandate, basically saying that once the repository infrastructure was in place, that open access should be a mandatory condition of European funding. And in 2012, the European Commission recognised research data as being as important as publications. And in July of 2012, they announced that there would be an open data pilot in Horizon 2020, which is the 8th framework programme. So if the patterns of open access to publications and open access to data mirror each other, and what happens in publications often happens in data one cycle further down the line. So in FP7 there was an open access pilot covering publications, and that became a mandate. It became an across-the-board requirement in FP8. Horizon 2020, which is FP8, includes an open data pilot. And if I were a betting man, I would suggest that it would be likely that it would become an across-the-board requirement in FP9. The main goals of these developments are, and this is probably the most important aspect, to lower barriers to accessing the products of publicly funded research. Some people use science as shorthand for research. I, as a humanities graduate, object to that, because what I do and what I did is not science, it is research. And furthermore, it strengthens the integrity and the longevity of the scholarly record. It leads to a more robust record. And I'll give some examples of why that was a problem and how it could be a problem again. So why is it important to link publications to the data which underpins them? As I said before, in short, it's because taking an active approach to research data management strengthens the scholarly record. Without active management of research data, data are often lost or become inaccessible, and that is a digital preservation problem. Computer technologies change, storage formats change, and without migration and dealing with that on an active level, you stand at risk of losing the evidence which underpins scholarship. Research data management also enables new kinds of scholarly output. There's been an emergence in very recent years of data publications and data papers, whereby scholars, researchers, research teams publish data and a description of how it was captured, but without any further scholarship on top of that. Basically saying, here is information that we captured, here is the information that you need, the metadata or the descriptive information that you need in order to determine whether it is relevant to you and of a sufficient quality for you to use in your research. And then you're free to go and build upon that. And you would cite the data paper as you would cite any other bibliographic resource. And looking forward into the future, the goal is of linked open data, where data is available openly. Each data set is linked to other data sets, and you can use improvements in computer technology and processing power to do things that the human brain simply is not capable of. We're talking about large-scale distributed computation on very large data resources. So it's incredibly exciting, but it can be quite a challenging change for some researchers who are used to things being done in a particular way. So data is, as I said, increasingly considered to be an important output of research. Another benefit of research data management is that access to data increases the transparency and the quality of scholarly communication, as well as the speed of scientific discovery. Knowing that your data may be accessed by others for whatever purpose that they wish has the effect of driving up the quality of data and reducing the risk of research fraud. It also improves chances of identifying research fraud where that occurs. Research data management, until recently, simply wasn't possible. Researchers have always published some data which underpins their scholarship, but it wasn't until quite recently, with the advent of the internet and distributed networked computing, it was not possible to structure the information, to transfer it electronically, to access it from a distance, etc. Many libraries have data sets available that predate the internet. Essentially, these are very large printed volumes of sheets, and if you're looking for a particular data point, you have to find the page and look for it, etc. It obviously takes a great deal of time, that for a computer it can be done in the blink of an eye. So the ideal scenario for research data is that anyone viewing a publication is able to locate and query the data set which underpins it, and vice versa. If you're looking at a data set, you can see the publications which rely upon or which cite that data set. And that's for whatever purpose they might have. Marshall McLuhan, the US scholar from the late 20th century, said that one person's signal is another person's noise, or vice versa, one person's noise is another person's signal. So you get a situation where people are able to reuse data for a purpose that was not considered by the original collectors, the original scholars. And you never know what other people will find of interest or of use in the work that you're doing. It's exactly the same in traditional publications. No one knows really who their ideal... People have a vision of the ideal reader. It's not always the person who reads their work. So ideally you can link and have a persistent and strong and robust link between the data and the paper, and even more ideally, if you can use visualization tools to interact directly with data via visualization processing tools, that's even better, but that's a kind of very high level goal. So linking between data sets and papers, these links are a necessary step as the culture of science and the culture of research in general continues to shift towards more openness, more sharing, and but thereby driving the rapidity and the transparency with which human knowledge advances. So these are all very high-minded goals, and everyone, by and large, agrees with them. But there are certain particulars about them which are more difficult to deal with than others, and that most of that is a human problem. It's not a technological problem. Machines are relatively easy to deal with because, by and large, they do as they're told. Humans are not as easy to deal with because, by and large, they do not do as they're told. So the old way of doing research followed a process not unlike this. This is obviously a very much simplified model, which would be a researcher would collect data or information. The researcher would interpret or synthesize that data and then write papers or books based on that data. The papers would be published, and via the process of publication they would be preserved and they'd be accessible into the future long after the researcher had moved on to another university or indeed had ceased to be alive. And what would happen would be the data, which is the evidence underpinning this publication, is left to what we call benign neglect. Nobody seeks to destroy it, but one day you go to look for it and it cannot be accessed. Therefore, you're missing the evidence base upon which the scholarship rests. So a useful formulation, a useful formula to think about is one which is derived from a paper by Timothy Vines, just from last year, published in Current Biology, and that is that data plus time equals no data if you don't carry out active interventions. So Vines and his colleagues looked at more than 500 studies of between 2 and 22 years old and found that every year the likelihood of the data, which was the evidence for these publications being available, fell by 17%. So there was a 17% chance each year, a cumulative chance, that you would not be able to access the data which underpinned the publication, and what you're left with is a system where you're forced to trust something based on either the reputation of the scholar, or more likely, because you probably don't know the scholar, the reputation of the institute in which they were a member, in which they were affiliated to. That was the best that could be done for quite a long time. It's no longer the best we can do now, because we can link publications and data and store them and ensure that those links last long into the future. So this is a process that requires active intervention to manage research data and to link it to the publication, so that the evidence base and the publication are kept together. So the new way of doing things, and this is a life cycle model which was developed by Data One, a large infrastructure project in the US, and the one stands for Observation Network for Earth. So it's again a climatological related bit of work. So from this is as you can see, a circular, or what we call an iterative model, which begins at the planning stage, collecting data, quality assurance, describing it, because having data that you can't understand is not always useful, preserving data for the longer term, enabling others to discover it, enabling others to integrate it, to merge it with other data sets, to carry out analysis, and then to feed into the next generation of research data projects. That is the new goal. It's only possible via active data management, sharing data where that is appropriate, and where indeed that is possible. And the reuse of data is one way of ensuring that it is preserved. If you are constantly accessing something, the chances of it one day being inaccessible become much more minimized. So the reason why we preserve things for the longer term is so that sometime in the future somebody can come along and reuse them. So the helicopter view on the benefits of sharing and publishing data. This is quite an important slide. If you don't take anything else away from this talk, I hope you'll take away this slide, which is transparency. I think people agree in general that the more openness there is about research, and indeed in anything public life, the less chance there is of fraud or corruption or indeed honest error going undiscovered. So the evidence that underpins research can be made open for anyone to scrutinize and attempt to replicate findings, which leads to a more robust scholarly record. There's the efficiency argument, which is that you can fund the collection of data once, and it can be reused many times for a great variety of purposes, unanticipated in many cases by the original collector. There's the accessibility argument, which is that third parties can access and build upon publicly funded research resources with minimal barriers to access. And there's the preservation argument, which is that some data is unique. If it's lost, it cannot be replaced, and publishing data serves to preserve it. You cannot rerun a census. You can't rerun a weather system. So you only have one opportunity to capture that data, and it has to be preserved. And in order to preserve that data, active intervention is crucial. So this is the bit that I was asked to speak about. All of that was preamble. How do we actually link data to publications? It can be boiled down to a citation and then a persistent identifier, or a link. So the way to do it, though, is to begin at the start of the process. The iterative Data One diagram, which I showed earlier, began at the planning or conceptualization stage. So it's important to think these things through. And if these things are considered at an early stage in the research life cycle, you stand a much better chance of getting to a satisfactory ending. So think, is the data that you are working with sensitive? Are there good reasons not to make it openly accessible, or to anonymize, aggregate, redact the data in some way? If you're dealing with data which relates to living humans, then they have rights. And those rights have to be respected. If you're dealing with commercially sensitive data, you may be working on research which is funded by the private sector, or you may be working on research which has the private sector as one of the partners. There may be intellectual property reasons why not everything can be made open. That's absolutely fine, and all of the funders that I'm aware of make provision for that kind of thing. but it's important to A, be aware of it, and B, reflect it in the documentation in some way. Assuming that the data which you are creating and the publications which you are creating will be published and made openly available in some place, you might like to think about what the proposed venues for publication might be. In some cases, higher education institutions, funders, publishers mandate the deposit of data and publications in a particular place. Not all disciplines are as well served as others. In the UK, we have 7 publicly funded research councils. 2 of those 7 operate their own data centres and in fact mandate that the data which their funded research produces has to be deposited in there. But that leaves 5 funders who don't mandate that. They don't offer their own data centres, and the researchers have to find a place for the data to live. In some disciplines, it's very obvious where it will go because they're very well served by a large and mature repository network. In other disciplines, like the arts and humanities, it's difficult to say where it will go because there isn't that repository infrastructure in place. So if there isn't a disciplinary repository for your data to be stored in, you might like to consider something open, like Zenodo, which is an open access data repository, which is operated by the people who run CERN. So, as Vines said, scholars make bad long-term custodians of their data sets. It's far better for the data to be stored for the long term by an institution, by a data center, by a library, because the interest in the data may last considerably longer than the lifetime of the researcher. So, it's important also to remember that research data management is a hybrid activity. It involves lots of different stakeholder groups. The principal investigator, in many cases, will be ultimately responsible for research data management. So it will be he or she who has the responsibility of ensuring that the data and the publications are shared, made available, deposited in accordance with the mandate, whatever mandate is in place coming from the funder. But as I imagine most of you will know, the principal investigators don't always have an entirely hands-on relationship with research and indeed with research data. So the research assistants are very important people to reach when talking about this. They may be more involved in day-to-day data management and writing papers and that kind of thing. Institution funding offices are important stakeholders because they might have a compliance role. They might need to make sure that what is being done under the roof of their university is in compliance with the funder mandate, with publishers' conditions, that sort of thing. Libraries are important. They may run the repository systems. They may liaise with external services to register persistent identifiers. I haven't spoken about them yet, but I will in a second. Increasingly, research is carried out on a much more international, interdisciplinary, consortium-based approach. It's rare now for research to be done only in one institution without any partners. Consequently, the need for communication has never been stronger. Addressing research data issues at the conceptualization stage, at an early stage in the research life cycle, is increasingly important in order that you can communicate between different disciplines, different countries, different institutions who may have different norms or different normal ways of doing things. When you introduce commercial partners into the equation, then it changes the dynamic once again, because there's a move in the public sector towards increased openness and transparency, but that is at odds with the commercial sector's natural inbuilt inclination, which is to keep everything under tight wraps because that is the commercial advantage. There's a tension there, and that needs to be addressed, and it has to be resolved. So, when linking research data to the publications which sit upon it, you need to do 2 things. You need to cite a data set and provide a link. And the link is in the form of what's called a persistent identifier. A data citation has a few important characteristics. A citation, in the same as a citation for a bibliographic resource, has to be able to identify uniquely the object which it cites. It has to provide the reader with enough information to access the resource, and it has to be usable not only by humans but by software tools. And the benefit of that is that you can do interesting things that weren't possible before, like assessing impact, seeing how many times a data set was used, and having bidirectional links between the data set and the publication, all of which helps things like the academic reward system. I don't know the situation in Lithuania, but in the UK, the more people read and the more impact your research has, the more chance you have of being elevated from a researcher to a senior researcher to a professor. And all of that stuff is increasingly important within the reward and recognition structure. So a data citation can include lots of different things. The most important things are the author who created the data set, its date of publication, and the place essentially where you can find it, the location, which is that persistent identifier. My colleagues Alex Ball and Monica Duke, who are based at the University of Bath, wrote a DCC how-to paper on data citation, and they give a useful overview here of different citation styles from the APA, from Chicago and Oxford styles, etc. Essentially, they all have the same information. Excuse me. The information is all the same, but you'll be familiar with different citation styles. So when you're citing data in a research paper, it's important to check with your publisher what citation style they expect to find it in. And beyond the citation, the persistent identifier is the unique address. It looks like a URL, essentially, which enables you to uniquely identify a resource and to point to it. A persistent URL, there are different kinds: handles, ARKs, or archival resource keys. But the one which is used most often and which has gained the most traction over the last couple of years is called the Digital Object Identifier System. Are people familiar with the term DOI? Yes. Okay. So essentially, the DOI system is a URL which resolves to an internet location. The internet location can and does change, but the DOI does not change. The DOI is a permanent link to a resource, and that solidifies the link between the publication and the data which underpins it. If you want or need to register a DOI for your data set, the normal way of doing that is via your data repository. It's, as I said before, repositories are the best place for data to be stored for the long term. Repositories also are able to liaise with DataCite or another third party in order to get these DOIs minted. Now, that's a chargeable service. It costs organisations who want to do that about €2,000 per year. If you're non-affiliated scholar, or you're working individually, or you don't have a repository, you can use an open repository like Zenodo, and Zenodo will assign a DOI to your data set to help make it more discoverable. And this is a quote from the Zenodo website. They assign all publicly available uploads a DOI to make them easily and uniquely citable. And Zenodo further supports harvesting of all content via the OAI PMH protocol. That's the Open Archives Initiative protocol for metadata harvesting. Basically, it's the way in which an automatic crawler goes around different archives and pulls out the metadata to make it much more discoverable. And one of the great benefits of Zenodo is it's run by CERN, it's free to use. There are currently no limitations on how much data you can deposit with them or on what file types you use. I dare say that if they were overwhelmed with lots of data and it was very large and it was causing them problems, they might review that policy in the future. But given that they deal with high energy physics, which are famously very, very large data sets, I don't think that will happen anytime soon. So it's a very useful resource to bear in mind, and some UK universities are actually using Zenodo as their data repository for the short term at least. So just a very quick section on some useful resources and further reading. I mentioned the how-to guide which my colleagues Alex Ball and Monica Duke created in 2012. It's a very quick primer on how to cite datasets and link them to publications. The Research Data Alliance, which I mentioned earlier, has a number of working groups and interest groups. I'm not entirely sure what the difference between a working group and an interest group is, other than that I assume that working groups do things and interest groups maybe just talk about them. But that could be slander. There have been a number of workshops on linking and contextualizing publications and datasets, and there's a link there to a recent one which was hosted in England. And an interesting paper which I haven't fully processed the implications of, but I saw. I've actually put 2014 here. I assume it was submitted in 2014 and given in 2015. It's a system for distributed minting and management of persistent identifiers from a guy called Lukasz Bolakowski from Warsaw. And his view is that because minting DOIs is something which has to be done by registration agencies, that it is somehow undemocratic, and that if a peer-to-peer system for minting DOIs could be established, then it would be much more in keeping with the system of with the values of openness. As I said, I haven't entirely processed this, but it was an interesting notion. And the way he described it was that peer-minted persistent identifiers are the Bitcoin of PIDs, as in they're not backed by a central authority, which would be the International DOI Federation in the case of DOIs. Some useful general research data management resources. The DCC produce lots of resources, and as I mentioned, they're all Creative Commons licensed. They're all free to access, and they're all accessed via our website, which is dcc.ac.uk. And these range from publications to training courses, tools. There's a disciplinary metadata resource so that you can describe your data in a format which is in keeping with your own disciplinary norms. And we run events like our International Digital Curation Conference and Research Data Management Forums, etc., which publish proceedings and things like that online. And we also carry out tailored support and consultancy, until recently limited to the UK, but we've now begun to look beyond the UK to support universities and research organisations in other countries. And as I said, we are and always have been involved in international and European projects such as FOSTA. So some good non-DCC resources on research data management are some books. Graham Pryor's Managing Research Data from 2012, which gives a UK/European context, and Joyce Ray's equivalent, which gives the American context, so with much more of a library focus than the Pryor book. And there are good research data management resources from the data centres in the UK, from the UK Data Archive, the Natural Environment Research Council. The European Union are beginning to develop resources because they have this open data pilot, and projects such as UDAT are developing resources to help researchers to meet the open data pilot conditions. And universities, especially in the UK and the USA and indeed Australia, are developing useful resources, which in many cases are Creative Commons licensed and can be repurposed by whoever wants to. And just finally, a couple of slides about the FOSTA project, which I'm contractually obliged to deliver. FOSTA stands for Facilitate Open Science Training for European Research. It has a particular focus on younger researchers to help them to adopt open access in the context of the European research area, to comply with open access policies and rules of participation set out in Horizon 2020. And that includes the open data pilot, which is new in FP in Horizon 2020. It aims to help people to integrate open access principles and practice in their current research workflows, to strengthen institutional training capacity, and to facilitate the adoption, reinforcement and implementation of open access policies. And that's being done in partnership with Pasteur for OA, which is about the harmonisation of European open access policies. The way in which this is being done is to identify and make discoverable existing content which can be reused in the context of different training activities. We've worked, and we continue to work with universities to translate materials mostly from English into other languages, and to pull together discipline-specific things. As I said before, I come from the humanities side of things, and so many resources talk about science and data, and that can be a bit of a turn-off if you are from the humanities, because you think, I don't work with data, I'm not a scientist, my methodologies are different. So even just changing the terminology so that it's more readily accepted can be quite a useful activity. The way in which the materials are being disseminated is via the Foster portal, and there are various help desk functions able to help with that. And we're also carrying out face-to-face training, such as this series of seminars. The idea being that people who attend Foster training can then go on and train people in language, their own languages, or language which is more readily accepted in their disciplinary community. So thank you very much, and ačiū. I'm sorry that's the only word in Lithuanian that I've picked up so far, but thank you.